subject at hand is the hormones of pregnancy, labor, birth, breastfeeding, and postpartum included. So let's dive right in, shall we? So when I'm teaching the 7 chapters of birth here in Knoxville in person, chapter number 1 is always the hormones of pregnancy, labor, and birth. It's so important to me that women get in tune and in contact with how hormones are such a regulatory part of getting pregnant, staying pregnant, going into labor, especially spontaneously, progressing through labor with a labor that culminates in the birth of a baby, and then segueing right into breastfeeding in the postpartum period. It's so important to me that women know and understand the importance of these hormones that I hit it first and foremost. Chapter 1, if you're not in Knoxville, gather up a group of pregnant friends, give me a date, and I'll come to you in person and chat about the hormones of labor and birth and everything else that's birth preparation. And if you're not up for an in-person trip to Knoxville or to have me come to you, just get set, because the online classes are in production right now, and chapter number 1 is absolutely going to be the hormones of pregnancy, labor, and birth. So that class actually gets quite in depth. It's about an hour long or so. Sometimes we even go beyond that time period. Today it's going to be much shorter. We're really only going to touch on 2 of the most important hormones that I think you should create some understanding around relative to labor and birth, especially. Not so much pregnancy, not so much postpartum, but of course it's all tied together. We are focusing big time on getting into labor, staying in labor, and having coming as close to what we can to have an unmedicated vaginal birth, if that's at all possible. So, and believe me, it's totally possible, because I see it happen all the time. So let's just dive right in, okay? This is an important subject because here in the U.S., as of last year, our induction rate hovered right around 41%, which is about 40% too high when it comes right down to it. That sort of means, if you think about it in just a slightly different language, that nearly half of all women in the U.S. do not go into labor all on their own. So I pulled that statistic from the Listening to Mothers survey, which is done on an annual basis. And is a much more actual, honest reflection of what happens out there for women in their childbearing years than a lot of birth certificate information that is gathered, because that information comes from providers and sometimes doesn't really provide an overall entirely clear picture about what happened with women during their pregnancies, labor, and birth, even though it should. So this Listening to Mothers survey goes straight to the source, goes straight to get the information from the horse's mouth, so to speak. And what that discovered in 2016 was that we had about 41% women who reported that their labor was at least attempted to be started via induction. And for some people that can mean a Foley bulb, for some it's Pitocin, for some it's Cytotec, for some there are other ways to get the ball rolling, or a combination of these things. That is kind of beside the point, and that's another video that's going to happen on down the road a little bit. Today we're talking about induction, or we're talking about hormones relative to induction, and why are our induction numbers so high. So if nearly half of all women have their labors started, something's going on with our bodies, right? And we need to take this back to the absolute brass tacks, which is getting pregnant, staying pregnant, having a baby, and the postpartum and breastfeeding are absolutely, unequivocally regulated by hormones. Absolutely no question about it. One of the main hormones is oxytocin, which is also known as the hormone of love. And this is one of the hormones we're going to be addressing today. So oxytocin is, it's pumping through a woman's system clear back to the day that she was conceived and then birthed, and so on and so forth. So that's good news, right? This is not something new that the body has to learn how to produce in order for a woman to go into labor. It's already there for most of us in exactly the quantities that we need to get our body to tip on over into labor without any kind of outside interference. The one thing that can interfere with the oxytocin release that's needed for contractions to begin, is the existence of adrenaline. So that's the second hormone that we're going to be referencing during this conversation. Oxytocin is kind of the get her going, and adrenaline is kind of the stop her, get her going, in other words. And in this culture, yes, we have women who are likely induced earlier in pregnancy than even their due dates, but we have a lot of fear around going beyond a due date, a lot of anxiety and angst about that. Typically, if you haven't had your baby by 39 weeks, you are getting ready to have a conversation about induction, whether you intend to or not. That conversation is probably going to exist, which only stirs up, for a lot of people, the occurrence of adrenaline being released into the system. So let's begin with oxytocin a little bit. So oxytocin is pumping through the system on a regular and daily basis. For most women, not a problem whatsoever. And the things that we love to do that give us that kind of feeling like I just can't wait till I get to do that again, that is normally associated with an oxytocin release. Of course, there's a surge of oxytocin that also happens at the end of birth that helps to promote that mother-infant bonding. And some folks think that there's probably even a link to that when it comes to further brain development in the baby. So it's so lovely when a baby is born very specifically to an unmedicated woman who gets that natural surge of oxytocin amongst other things for not only herself, but for her baby's development, ongoing development as well. A little bit of sidebar information. But we don't have oxytocin typically pumping through our systems at the rate needed to really go into labor. That's a special amount of oxytocin that's released in the brain. It's felt in the uterus and in other parts of the body, perhaps, as labor goes on. But in any case, that's the hormone that creates contractions. It's the hormone that's released when we have that good feeling. It's why I really love to teach classes in person, because when women get together and socialize and talk and have a sip of their water, labor aid, whatever they might be sipping on, and chew on a snack, their oxytocin levels rise. They begin to bond with women in the room. They begin to relax and have a good time, actually, and enjoy themselves. So it's really kind of a sidebar deliciousness aspect of teaching class, because I get to be in that environment and take advantage of having that warm, glowy feeling every time that I leave the room. So in any case, oxytocin needs to be released to produce contractions. It needs to keep being released in, we're going to call it spurts, into your system at the rate with which each individual woman needs her oxytocin to be released. So hence, this has a lot to do with why you hear women who've had a natural unmedicated birth that necessarily was not induced by any means per se, other than natural release of hormones and so on. When they have it to compare to an induction, they typically say that the natural birth was actually much easier, even though we've been taught to expect that natural birth is very hard and painful. Because the truth is, the contractions that are created, oftentimes via Pitocin or Cytotec, are much more difficult to manage than those that are produced by oxytocin, because it's released into our systems at the rate that is appropriate for us, even when we don't agree in the moment. So that's a little funny thing to think about. Now, what I want to make mention of is, and what I begin to encourage my clients to do right from the beginning of our relationship, is to begin to recognize what sorts of things in your particular life are the things that release oxytocin. So for me, my cup of tea when it comes to releasing oxytocin are my great friends, music, good food, and togetherness. I love getting together with my lady friends whom I know I am not going to be responsible for their having a good time. They're not responsible for my having a good time or not. We get together and we share in one another's experience. We have community and conversation. We generally eat and have some music in the background. That raises my oxytocin level. Now, there are other women for whom going out on a hike is what raises their oxytocin level, being out in nature, feeling the sun on their backs, and so on and so forth. That's terrific. The thing is, we have to identify what our own oxytocin releasers are. so that if we begin to near that day, the almighty due date, or go beyond it, those are the kinds of things that you want to be involved in so that you're raising your own personal oxytocin level and not Sally Joe's oxytocin level down the road because doing XYZ was what worked for her, but might not necessarily for you, right? So if you're not a hiker and you do go out for a couple miles and feel the sun on your back and get hot and so on and so forth, there's a whole different way that you might interpret that activity that doesn't equate with going into labor that somebody who likes hiking does. So you see, it's personal, it comes from within, and you've got to take the time and the responsibility that it takes to identify what that thing or things are for you. So give that some consideration, and if you are facing the inevitable induction conversation, you can meet that conversation knowing full well what you're going to do that's going to help tip your body into an oxytocin release. So, that said, the other hormone I made reference to is adrenaline. And adrenaline is often what keeps women from going into labor or progressing all the way through labor because we have so much fear in this culture around birth. There's a lot of angst, there's a lot of anxiety. And of course, Mother Nature, in her never-ending attempt to help newborns have their best start possible, has made sure that in an instance where adrenaline is being released in the body, now remember how the human reacts to adrenaline. We refer to it as, you usually hear fight or flight. A lot of people in the birth community have also begun to add freeze to the concept of what adrenaline makes us do. So fight, flight, or freeze. It means we're either about to take on a foe, we're about to run from the foe, or we freeze and do nothing at all. None of which is terribly helpful when it comes to childbearing. So if you really truly are in trouble or sense danger, a release of adrenaline is an absolute appropriate thing to have happen, right? To get you on your way, to be able to take someone on, or to freeze and maybe stop for a minute. Those are all appropriate reactions for those moments in time. But when we're in childbirth, and because our culture looks at the onset of labor and immediately begins to look at the finish line, there really isn't an appropriate space for there to be a pause, a plateau in labor, because then everybody freaks out and feels like we got to do something to get the ball rolling again, rather than just be patient. So Mother Nature has ensured that no newborn's coming out in a space where it feels, or the mother's body is perceiving, there is some sort of danger. The thing about childbirth is that danger can be real or it can be imagined, and your body's going to respond the same way, and that's with the release of adrenaline. And adrenaline and oxytocin generally do not exist in the same body. So somebody who is releasing adrenaline for whatever reason is probably going to have a pause in their labor, a plateau, where things just either remain the same for a very long period of time. And of course, there are other reasons for that too. Sometimes it's positioning of the baby or what have you. But adrenaline release due to anxiety or fear, wariness, unease, too much light, too much noise, too many interruptions, quite often is what has to do with those blips that happen in labor that just take a little time to get back on track. So we're speaking about it today, though, relative to the hormone oxytocin, because oxytocin gets you into labor. If you experience a release of adrenaline, you're probably going to have some sort of a give and take that happens there. If you've got great support, if you've got somebody to kind of help you get back on track and get your focus in place, this probably won't affect you too much. But for those of you who don't have that, this can be a fairly exceptional problem when it comes right down to it. So it's important to know about the hormones of labor. Get yourself familiar with what oxytocin does to your body, what you do to experience a nice oxytocin release. Usually in pregnancy for women, that has to do with feminine energy type stuff. Take a look around and on the internet and get some good suggestions, but more than that, just pay attention to your own personal life. The things that just make you go, things that make you go, that's what you want to hit on, okay? Those are the things that are going to put you into labor. We recently asked this question over at the online doula group on Facebook, and some of the replies that people gave were fantastic. They were watching movies and sitting on the couch with loved ones and listening to comedians and laughing. And it was those activities that, as they look back, they realized they were doing when they went into labor. So there you go. It's not always about walking, eating spicy food and having sex. Sometimes those things will help for some people, but they won't help everyone all the time. So you've got to hone in on what works for you and what releases oxytocin in your system. The other thing that you have to work on is when you experience an adrenaline surge, when you feel fear. If you were to be laying in bed at night and hear, come into wakefulness and think that you hear the door creaking open, and immediately your heart pounds and you begin to sweat a little bit and your mouth kind of dries out, that's the adrenaline surge that I'm talking about, right? And as a matter of fact, we don't even know at that moment if that's real or imagined. So there's a good example of how adrenaline can affect our bodies when we don't even know for sure that there's really something to be fearful of. But if you have ever had that experience, then you know what I'm talking about. It can also show up like butterflies in your stomach, which can result in acid reflux and heartburn for some people. When you experience an adrenaline surge, what do you need to do to come back down off that and gain some perspective? The breath is probably going to be wildly wound up into that. Slow, deep, meditative breaths get you back on track and able to focus. But a lot of us have other tricks and tips and techniques for what gets us down off that adrenaline surge, so that especially in labor or preparing to go into labor, oxytocin at least stands a chance of being able to get in there and do what it needs to do to get your body running and going with contractions in an effort to hopefully circumnavigate having to spend time thinking about preparing for or enduring an induction. Okay? So, this is Barb with the Online Doula, and I'm signing off. Know that you can always join us on Facebook at the Online Doula Group. You can pop on over to theonlinedoula.net. Keep an eye out for more videos and good news. A podcast is coming in conjunction with a bi-weekly live video with my former doula partner, now birth photographer. But there'll be more on that on down the line. Just keep an eye out for it. Join us at the Online Doula or at theonlinedoula.net, and we'll be back with you next week with a little bit